You're with The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for staying with us. It's estimated that trillions of dollars that would benefit the public are lost each year due to public corruption. That's including bribery, embezzlement, money laundering, and tax evasion. Today in Cleveland, the topic of corruption and how to address it will be the focus of a panel discussion. This is happening at the annual meeting of the Council for International Programs USA. That's a nonprofit organization founded in Cleveland after the atrocities of World War II by a Jewish man, and the group has gone global. Its mission is to promote international understanding through professional development and cross-cultural exchange programs. The Jones Day Law Firm is hosting the meeting and the panel today, and some of the participants of the panel are here with us today to talk about why fighting corruption is so important for the public good. Joining me in studio, we have Justin Herdman, who will moderate the panel. He's a partner at Jones Day and also a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. Justin, welcome to the Sound of Ideas.
Thank you, Stephanie.
We also have with us Veronica Dragolin, who will speak on the panel. She's also a partner at Jones Day and the former chief prosecutor in the Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office for the Republic of Moldova. Veronica, thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Now, if you would like to join the conversation, you can give us a call. That number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Now, Veronica, corruption is a word that gets used a lot, especially in polarized politics. So how do you make people care about it and not just tune it out every time they hear it?
I definitely think bringing it to our everyday life and realizing that when some money exchanges hands between, let's say, a public official and a private company, it's not something that doesn't touch the rest of us. I think it's particularly stark, and you can see those effects in countries like Moldova, Romania, some of the other sort of newer democracies in the world where corruption being so endemic leads to people being afraid to invest in those economies and those countries because it becomes unpredictable and it becomes too risky to know that public officials could potentially ask you for a bribe and to be able to get a permit to build a building or something like that. And it incentivizes, if corruption gets sort of out of hand, the promotion of companies that are willing to break those rules at the detriment of companies and employees that are honest and unwilling to play by those types of corrupt schemes. So it tends to have a really terrible economic effect in a particular region, and for that reason it's so important to constantly push back on it in that part of the world, but also here in the United States in terms of making sure we have a respect for the rule of law and that's what really governs our society in general.
And when we talk about corruption, can you tell us, so that we can kind of try and make this as real and tangible for people as we can, about the impacts on public safety and also personal prosperity?
Sure. So in terms of public safety, I mean, sometimes, for example, if a company were to pay bribes to an inspector, a building inspector that's coming in to be able to make sure that everything's up to code, the fire code or building codes. If a company decides to cut corners and instead pay off that public official and the official accepts the bribe, what you're then doing is permitting a building to go up that violates some of those safety codes that have been set into place, and that could potentially lead to catastrophic results, including public safety issues for the citizens affected by something like that. So it certainly has the potential to really lead to devastating effects.
Justin, I'll ask you about your time as a U.S. attorney, and in your time there, what was the volume of corruption cases that you were seeing?
It was significant. It was a constant area that we had to focus on. And I also want to say, not every case that came in either to the FBI or to our office ended in a prosecution. There was an investigation. There was determination of whether or not there had actually been any corrupt activity. And more often than not, we elected not to pursue a case in court because we didn't have sufficient evidence or we didn't think that a crime had been committed. But the volume was still pretty steady. We had a unit that was devoted to investigating and prosecuting white-collar crime and corruption, and we also handled that out of our branch offices in Toledo, Akron, and Youngstown. And so unfortunately, the reality is that even here in the United States, that type of activity is still underway. It seems to be focused usually more on the local and state level, But any level of government can be subject to corruption and bribery.
Here in the U.S., Justin, an independent judiciary is a main part of our system of checks and balances. So, as a former U.S. attorney, how are you feeling about that level of independence now in the country?
Yeah, I think, when you look around the country and if you have policy disagreements with the administration, and I think this would have gone the same way in the past administration, those policy disagreements typically end up in court in some way or another. Just last week we had arguments in a case involving tariffs, and those were argued at the Supreme Court. And I think the level of scrutiny that administration actions get from the judiciary should give confidence to the public that the judiciary is very active in these litigated disputes and is not afraid about being skeptical of administration action if that's deemed to be against contrary to the Constitution or prevailing statutes. And we do, I think, see, particularly on the federal level, a judiciary that is acting independently, despite what you may think based on political disagreements and policy disagreements elsewhere in the country.
Veronica, I'll ask you now. A delegation from Romania will be part of the panel discussion today that's being hosted at Jones Day Law Firm. So what can you tell us about the landscape for nations like Romania and Moldova when it comes to corruption and confronting it versus how it happens here in the United States?
It is different in terms of the historical context of those countries versus the United States. There, I think no one would disagree with the concept that corruption is much more endemic in terms of sort of touching everyday life, from the lowest levels to the highest levels, including things like going to the doctor's office, being expected to pay something to the doctor out of pocket, or paying a police officer that maybe stops you for a speeding ticket. I think those countries, Moldova, Romania in particular, have made huge strides in the past in terms of rooting out some of those everyday types of schemes, but it's a challenge. And I think for me, having practiced as a prosecutor here in the United States in the federal system and then practicing in Moldova, the biggest difference, the starkest thing that stood out was corruption within the justice system itself. So in Moldova, it was very common to catch sort of in the act a prosecutor accepting a bribe, judges accepting bribes. We investigated those types of cases and captured it on video. That's not the type of thing that you hear about here in the United States. And I think trying to battle corruption with the system where the people themselves that are responsible for enforcing the rule of law are susceptible or sometimes compromised makes that that much more of a challenge. And fortunately, I think here in the United States, those types of cases are very far and few between in terms of judges taking bribes, prosecutors taking bribes in cases, and especially in the federal system.
Thank you for drilling down on that, and especially your experience with what was happening when you were prosecuting cases in Moldova. I just personally think it's interesting to think about the concept of having to pay a doctor when we talk about corruption. I think high-level corruption, a lot of people think of deals being done in back rooms in politics, but not necessarily those necessary services that you need access to in your everyday life. It's wild to think about. Now, I want to remind people that we are talking about corruption in light of a panel that will be happening. It's a cross-cultural conversation that will be hosted at Jones Day Law Firm today. If you have any questions about corruption in any facet or a comment you'd like to share, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. Now, Justin, every administration, when it comes into power in the U.S., sets its own judicial priorities. So can you talk about that process and how it impacts the work of the Justice Department, particularly agenda setting? Does that have an impact on the legal process?
Yeah, and I think if we're talking about corruption, we're probably talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a statute that's been on the books for, 50 years now. Prohibits U.S. companies from paying bribes overseas to secure business or for a variety of other reasons. But early on in the administration, there was a pause in FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, enforcement activity, and then a revision of guidelines for prosecutors on how to pursue those cases. And It's very typical for any new administration to reprioritize DOJ resources. And we saw that again here with the guidance that was promulgated with respect to the FCPA. What the administration has said is that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act will still be enforced, but that the prioritization will be on bribes that are paid with respect to drug cartel activity, transnational criminal organization activity, human trafficking and smuggling, tariff evasion, those types of offenses, as opposed to what the administration has said is prosecutions that would disadvantage American companies. And so, again, this is the kind of thing that we typically see administration by administration. In a couple years, if there's a Democratic administration, we may see a change back to more historical trends with respect to the FCPA and prioritization of more typical FCPA type of offenses.
Veronica, I want to ask you, what kind of tactics did you find to be most effective during your time in Moldova when you were addressing corruption and improving public trust?
I think two aspects that you touched on. So in terms of actually being able to prove a corruption case, as we all know, normally corruption involves two parties, and they both have a self-interest to not have their agreement come to light. So it's actually very challenging to uncover those types of things. I think whistleblowers and sort of encouraging people to come forward, creating incentives for cooperation are good tools to actually be able to uncover these schemes. And also having, in most cases, we sort of need direct evidence, because oftentimes various maybe, unsavory business dealings that we might not like do not cross the line of becoming criminal in terms of corruption. So as a prosecutor, having to look very carefully at, is this type of conduct something that maybe breaks some ethical rules, but not actual criminal law. So being able to actually record conversations. And again, you can only do that if you have a cooperating witness who's willing to go in there on the inside and do that. And I think that I've seen that both in the U.S. system and the Moldovan system, being able to incentivize cooperation on behalf of companies as well as individuals is a great way to be able to uncover the most serious types of crimes. And then the second part of your question, when you touched on public trust, I think a big part of that is being able to be transparent about the decisions that are being made by a prosecution office in terms of why prosecute a particular case and not a different one, so as not to be susceptible to criticism that the office is being favoring certain types of individuals or people versus others. And so in the United States, I think we have a system that's quite good at giving the public access to filings, right? Being able to read an indictment, being able to read the motions that get filed in court. Whereas in Moldova and Romania and other parts of Europe, the public has less access to that. So I think building public trust, you can do that through transparency and being able to justify decisions based on the law.
Veronica Dragolin and Justin Herdman, both partners with Jones Day, thank you very much for being here and being a part of bringing this conversation on corruption and anti-corruption to Cleveland today.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.